Hello, welcome back to my channel. Sorry I haven't been with you for a while. Had a lot of things on, and to be honest, I haven't really felt that creative in terms of writing short stories. It's not the problem with the hat, which is my new method for idea generation. It's just other things going on in life. But I am back with a new story, first time for several weeks. And this title was suggested by the hat, and it is called Will We Ever Be Free? The instant John knew what love was, he knew that he simultaneously wanted nothing to do with it, and that he couldn't live without it. He was 6 years old, and Joanne Fletcher had just appeared at his school, an exotically red-headed English girl with a cut-glass accent, a family Mercedes, and a whole new set of ideas. Joanne somehow made him feel like a lumpen proletarian Scot, even in the well-to-do enclave of Benally, southwest of the city of Edinburgh, at the foot of the Pentland Hills. He both resented and desired her, even before he knew what resentments or desire were. The excitement when he placed his elaborately pocketed Valentine's Day card in her labelled tray in the open-plan classroom area at their primary school was only matched by the crushing disappointment he felt when one of her friends, she had made several within the first 2 weeks of attending Benally, trotted over at break time to ask if he wanted it back. Thus began a familiar repeating cycle of longing, hope, uncertainty, disappointment, and despair, as John, not a bad-looking boy, but an entirely neurotic one, threw himself into unrequited love affair after unrequited love affair. His taste was Catholic, the girls in question having little in common but their unavailability to him. At 12, he tried to woo Morag, the 5'9" football player, despite the 4-inch difference between their heights, a gulf he'd soon learn was uncrossable for the vast majority of women. At 15, John set his sights on Rupa, the teenage daughter of the local grocery store owner. Her smile melted in his mouth, along with the Orkney fudge he bought there far too frequently. When he eventually bought a packet of the sugary, sickly substance and handed it to Rupa as a long-planned, supposedly spontaneous gift, she thought he'd changed his mind and wanted a refund. He gave up trying to explain and ran from the shop to sit on the swings in the local park while boys from the rougher school in the valley mocked him. At 21, an age when he should have known better, in his final year studying English, he attempted to win the heart of Emma, a long-legged blonde student whom he'd once walked home to her architect parents' modern build in Morningside. John's plan was to surprise Emma with her favourite flower, a dozen white roses, filched from a neighbouring garden that seemed to have a mad profusion of them. He climbed out of his student dig's bed at 5:30 a.m, an hour before dawn, and walked bleary-eyed yet excited to her neighbourhood, with secreted secateurs. At number 28, the avenue, he cut the only 8 blooms he thought he could get away with, and placed them, wrapped in a note requesting dinner, in a milk bottle on Emma's doorstep. 4 days passed, and with nary a comment from Emma, John finally worked up the courage to ask her, "Did you get my flowers?" "What flowers?" was her genuine but blithe response. It transpired that, with Emma's mother expecting twins, they'd sold the house and moved to a detached Victorian manse in Dreghorn. John was too embarrassed to explain himself, so he added Emma to his mental list of calamities and moved on. John never blamed the girls for these misunderstandings or romantic catastrophes. He seldom blamed himself either. He blamed fate, which he saw incarnated as a giant yet invisible Toby jug, cherub-cheeked and perpetually laughing at his misfortune. When John's cup runneth over, it runneth over with sulphuric acid, burning away his self-esteem and his hope of one day being normal, whatever that meant. At 23, John finally lost his virginity to a mousy 18-year-old who immediately left for an American gap year. Ivy sent him a grand total of 3 neatly inscribed postcards from, respectively, Manhattan, the Grand Canyon, and New Orleans, before ghosting him for several months. When she returned to Edinburgh, Ivy insisted on meeting him to show him seemingly every photograph she'd taken during her trip. In those days, this involved hefting 5 volumes of paper snaps to the city centre cafe, where they had their awkward reunion, dry-lipped kiss, and where Ivy made him linger over all 8 million snaps of the wonderful times he'd enjoyed in the United States without him. John's desire died alongside his attention. At 25, John went on a date with a Japanese beauty he'd met at a party. He thought he'd heard Yuki say she'd just broken up with her boyfriend of 4 years, although the gas mask made her hard to understand. It was a Halloween event. What was clear was that there was absolutely no way Yuki could be wearing underwear beneath that skin-tight black cocktail dress with its ascending ladder of letterbox-wide holes up both sides. John's lust was inflamed and his fate sealed. They met at a basement cocktail bar in Mayfair, the kind of joint John wouldn't normally be able to afford, nor could he on this occasion if he was honest. Of course, since they were meeting at 6 p.m. after work, and this was the sort of place that didn't warm up until 9, he found himself fighting the lack of atmosphere the second they walked in. They were the only customers, outnumbered by bar staff to a ratio of 2 to 3. Making the best of it, John selected the coziest, most discreet corner booth and let his date choose her seat. Yuki sat facing the dramatic Rousseau-esque wallpaper, while John headed to the bar to obtain their porn star martinis. The tables and chairs were arranged erratically across the floor space, and square columns propped up the concrete ceiling of the small basement. Deciding to squeeze in a quick bathroom break, John stormed towards a pillar, planning to weave between it and a nearby table. What he hadn't noticed was a square metal shelf attached to the pillar at forehead height, propping up some random Hawaiian trinkets, including an ornate ukulele. John walked into the shelf at a pace that drove its edge into his forehead, made him almost black out with the pain and stagger towards the bar, while bar staff rushed to his aid. As he was led to a stool behind a conveniently placed Victorian screen at the far end of the bar, John looked in Yuki's direction. She was absorbed in her phone, facing away from him and entirely unaware of this incident. The staff gave him a cold compress, offered to call a taxi, and made sure he wasn't feeling queasy or faint, and John brushed off most of their administrations, accepting only the blue catering plaster the pretty young bartender applied to his forehead. When he returned to the corner booth a few minutes later, holding 2 martini glasses and 2 shots of Prosecco, Yuki's expression flipped with remarkable speed from pleasurable relief at the drinks arriving to bemusement and concern. When she inquired, "Are you all right?" John couldn't help but append, "In the head." They never saw one another after that short-lived 2-drink evening. Aged 28, John was studying yet another degree in screenwriting at Sheffield Hallam University and enjoying a rare boom time in his sexual conquests, although most dissolved into disappointingly one-night stands. One day, John decided to attend a screening at the local art house cinema, The Showroom, one of the 3 Colours trilogy movies by Kieslowski. Except, with his usual flair for error, he'd got the timings wrong and arrived a full 40 minutes before his friend Bobby would. He decided to buy the tickets in advance and approach the counter. A pretty, young girl, perhaps 23 years old, stepped out from behind a popcorn maker, hair perfectly bobbed, nose retroussé, the very epitome of gamine. Jean looked like she belonged in a Kieslowski film, or perhaps a classic phase Godard. "What can I help you with?" John instinctively took a step back, a visual equivalent of an indrawn breath. Jean realised she was still holding the popcorn scoop out like a sword. She laughed. "Ah, don't mind this. The worst I could do is butter you to death." It was a perplexing non sequitur and nervously delivered, but it immediately ingratiated Jean to John. He began to link their names together. They even sounded alike. John and Jean. It was too perfect. The familiar obsession swelled itself into being. That first day they talked for 12 minutes, until Bobby appeared and interrupted in his bluff, unobservant manner. After the movie, when John confessed his new fixation, Bobby merely shrugged and commented, "Fair enough, she's cute, that one." One problem presented itself as John proceeded to see every new film in the showroom over the course of the next 8 weeks. Jean had a boyfriend. It was a problematic relationship, and Jean was attempting to disentangle herself from it, but her boyfriend Sven had several intractable and serious mental health problems. "I'm waiting for an opportunity when I can let him down gently," Jean revealed. That moment never came. Meanwhile, John cajoled her into seeing a film with him, Svankmeyer's Alice, which disturbed and amused Jean in equal measure, and then having a drink with him. Each phase in his wooing had to be accomplished as if he was handling something precious with tongs. One false move and she'd retreat. The phrase, "my boyfriend," seemed to leap to her lips with alarming frequency, even though she told John his name and could easily have referred to Sven. John took each mention as a warning. Hopefully their frequency would soon diminish. After many casual and not too casual suggestions, he persuaded Jean to join him for a Sunday afternoon walk, after her brief matinee shift ended. It was early autumn, and the turning leaves of Exile Park in the golden hour were as picture-perfect as he'd hoped. They sat on a bench, and John slipped his arm casually across the backrest, touching Jean's shoulder with his fingers. She turned to him, about to speak, and he acted on rash impulse, pushing forward to kiss her. Her soft lips and warm breath quickened his pulse, and he felt a slight stiffening in his jeans as his tongue found hers. She pulled away after a few seconds, but her kiss had been exploratory. She was into him. Nothing significant happened as they walked back towards their homes. Fortunately, they lived within a couple of streets of one another. John resisted the attempt to hold her hand, knowing she had enough to think about after the kiss. They made small talk, and then the rain came on. By the time they reached his place, daggers of icy rain were plunging down, and Jean gratefully agreed to step inside to borrow an umbrella. John gave her a towel for her hair and put the kettle on. "A warming brew before you go?" Hesitation and the ghost of a wince, then a nod of assent. However, when the tea was made, Jean sat in an armchair rather than on the settee. John had to content himself with looking at her frail bird-like form as she perched, cup and saucer in hand, sipping. She'd taken her gloves off and placed them on the radiator to warm up rather than dry. They parted without a firm arrangement to meet, and Jean evaded his kiss, allowing it to land upon her neck. She also refused his offer of a walk to her door. Too risky, in case Sven saw. John thought he'd have to back off a little. Tactical retreat was much easier in those days before mobile phones were prevalent. He had a crude Nokia. Jean had nothing but a landline he'd not asked for. But John knew he could see her at the showroom any time he liked, assuming she was working. The next film he could feasibly want to see, Tarkovsky's Stalker, was in 10 days' time. What a wait that would be. However, for some reason, John felt it was important he attend a film he actually wanted to see, rather than suffer the latest John Woo or endure the Antonioni season. A director so tedious, John nicknamed him Antonioni. That way, if rejection was to be his fate, at least he'd have the cinema to console him. 5 days into the wait, however, he spotted Jean in arm with a tall, bearded gentleman at least 10 years her senior. They were walking through the winter gardens in the direction of the station. John, approaching from behind, decided to march past them at speed, avoiding potential eye contact. He could always claim he'd not seen her. However, the encounter troubled him. If Jean was trying to withdraw from Sven, why did they look so cosy, elbows entangled, bumping shoulders? Merely comfort and custom? He wanted to intervene, to appear at the showroom, reminding Jean subliminally of the kiss, but it was far too soon. He didn't want to appear desperate. Then fate delivered him a magical opportunity, a fairy tale moment in the making. John was taking some clothing off the living room radiator, where it had been drying. His housemate Brian's running gear. It had been there for 3 days and was irritating him. As John leaned in, head against the wall, to yank a trapped drawstring free, he spied something black and woolen between radiator and plaster. A glove. John used a pair of barbecue tongs to retrieve the lost item. A black woolen glove, a little dusty and rather larger than he'd imagined Jean's hands might be, but then he'd not been paying that much attention to them. Surely this was Jean's glove. She must have left it behind. Why hadn't she said? John guessed that she simply felt awkward, bothering him for something so trivial. It might make her seem too desperate. He thrilled at the notion that she might be playing the same games he was. This was just the permission he needed. John could return her glove, say he was just passing on the way to the station, practically adjacent to the showroom. Knowing she had a regular Sunday shift, he enacted his cunning scheme exactly 1 week after their romantic park walk. Wearing his best wry smile, John hovered outside the glass-fronted foyer until he could see the ticket counter was free. Jean was there, fetching in a slim-fitting woolen V-neck and jeans. John marched in, glove in hand, right up to the counter, where he slapped the garment down onto the faux marble countertop. "This, I'm guessing, is yours," he said, with exaggerated triumph. Expecting to play the prince to Jean's Cinderella, she merely looked at him open-mouthed, and then down at the glove, and back up at his now frowning face. The glove was enormous. Clearly the bedraggled discard of a huge man. The patina of dust he'd painstakingly washed off should have clued him in. The glove had clearly been down the back of the radiator for years. "That's not my glove," Jean intoned, with as neutral an expression as possible. Recalling this last incident over 20 years later, John can't really remember what happened next. Nothing good, he seems to recall. Blushing and stammering, mostly, he suspected. He could remember a flicker of something like pity in Jean's expression as she consigned him to her mental box marked "madmen and obsessives, avoid." And what had John learned in the intervening 2 decades? Very little. He'd slept with 24 women, very few of them more than once or twice. His longest relationship had lasted 3 years and had ended 7 months ago in a half-hearted and gently rejected marriage proposal. He'd resigned himself to being bad at relationships. Yet here he was, hope in hand, on his 7th Bumble date, and with the 7th woman he'd met from the dating site. Monique, a tall, elegant black estate agent with a love of poetry and art house cinema, or so she claimed. They'd exchanged 41 messages before she agreed to meet. He suggested coffee, his go-to option for quick disentanglement. As he waited in the Foyles Cafe on Charing Cross Road, John made plans for how the date might proceed after tea and cake, perhaps a browse amongst the travel section, or in Ray's music shop, prior to a cocktail or 2 in Soho. Who was he kidding, though? It was just as likely, more than likely, to end with a platonic half-hug outside the tube station and a false promise to stay in touch. Damn this downbeat pessimism. It would hardly do to begin with the presumption of fail. John didn't finish that thought, since Monique had appeared at the top of the stairs, interestingly clutching a cookery book. Her smile when she recognized him shone like the sun after a spring shower. All despair left John, and his dwindling fountain of hope began to flow once more. Now, there were 2 ways I could have ended that story, and I went for the happy one, because why not? The hopeful one. I should say that most of those stories are, in fact, things that happened to me at various points in my dating history. Not all of them, but most of them. I've obviously changed the names of the poor victims to preserve their innocence. So that's my little response to that title. Will we ever be free? Will we indeed? And that story is dedicated to anyone who's still out there in the world of internet dating. And I'll be back with another piece, hopefully not in several weeks' time. I'll try and come up with my next short story much quicker, or return with something more discursive, because I do want to keep this channel growing, and hopefully growing if I can. So for now, until I have something else to talk about, thanks for listening.